Although I'm installing ESXi 7 on a virtual machine in my lab environment, you can follow this exact same process if you need to install it on a physical host. So I'm going to create a new virtual machine here in VMware Workstation, and I'm going to do a custom configuration. And I'll just check my virtual machine compatibility level here, and here we go. So we have the option to choose an installer disk image. This is just like putting a DVD or CD inside of your physical machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to find the installation media for ESXi 7. And here it is, the ESXi 7 installer ISO image. So this is the boot media. If I want to install ESXi on a host, I can boot from this and install ESXi 7. So what I've just done is the virtual equivalent to putting a CD or a DVD in my drive. And so now I'm going to go ahead and hit next here. And I'm going to name my virtual machine, I'm just going to name it ESXi 01. If you have a physical host, of course, you won't have to do that. And I'll choose the amount of resources that I want to grant to this virtual machine. And now I'll have to choose some of the resources that I'm going to grant this virtual machine. Again, these are things that you're only going to have to do if you're deploying your ESXi host as a virtual machine. But if that's what you're doing, maybe you're following along in your own home lab, you can just follow the steps shown here to give the necessary resources to this virtual machine. Okay, so now what I've basically done is I've created the virtual hardware for my ESXi host. And again, in real life, you're probably going to have physical hardware. So you're not going to have to complete these same steps that you see me completing here. You'll have physical hardware already set aside for this host. And so now what I'm going to do is power this virtual machine on, and it should boot up utilizing the ISO image that I've identified. And so let's go ahead and click on Finish here. And now we can see it's powering on and it's loading the ESXi installer from the boot media. So if you have a physical host and you just inserted your installation media, this is what that boot process would look like. And so this part will take just a moment, but eventually it'll bring me to a screen where I can start the ESXi 7 installation process. So I'm going to pause my recording and I'll resume when we get to that screen. And you can see here I actually have a little bit of an error. I made a mistake when I was setting up this virtual machine. I'm actually going to go ahead and allocate a network adapter to this VM because that's a requirement of ESXi 7 that we have at least one network adapter. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up here. And now I'll go ahead and reboot my virtual machine, and we can give this another shot. All right, and now that I've added a network adapter, my installation is working properly here. So I'm just going to hit enter to continue the ESXi 7 installation process, and I'll accept the end user license agreement. And now on this particular host, I only have one disk. And on many hosts, you might have multiple disks. You might have multiple storage devices, and some of them may be used as a VMFS volume. And so we'll be able to tell here, as you can see, we've got a little star indicator showing us if a virtual disk currently contains a VMFS partition. And that's probably a disk that's being used for a local data store. I only have one disk here. I'm going to use that disk to install ESXi. So I'll go ahead and click on Enter to continue here. And I'll choose my keyboard layout. I have a standard United States default keyboard, so I'll choose that option. I'll set my root password for the ESXi host here. So now I've got my root password put in. I'll hit Enter to continue, and it'll ask me to confirm that I want to actually install ESXi 7. I'll go ahead and click on F11 and allow the process to complete. And this part's going to take a little while, so I'll pause my recording. And now we can see that the installation has been successfully completed. Now's the time to remove any installation media. If you have a disk that you're using in your local physical server, it's time to remove that now. And for my VMware Workstation virtual machine, I'll just simply disconnect it from the ISO image. So now, when I reboot this virtual machine, it should reboot into the installed version of ESXi 7, and it won't boot from the boot media. And here we can see it's rebooting and it's loading up ESXi. So I'll pause my recording until it finishes booting. Okay, so my boot process is complete. I'm just going to hit F2 here and I'm going to go ahead and log in with the root credentials. And let's take a look. I'm going to go to Configure Management Network. And we can see here that my ESXi host has acquired an IP address using DHCP. So let's go to the IP version 4 configuration. And yeah, I've gotten a dynamic IP address. I want to change that though. I want to set a static IP address for this host. Now, before I do that, let me back up a little bit here and just explain where we are. This is the DCUI, or the Direct Console User Interface. This is used for some very basic administration tasks for this ESXi host. This is not where I am going to modify virtual machines. This is not where I'm going to set up vCenter features and stuff like that. This is for the very basic tasks that are required to get ESXi up and running. Things like configuring the management network, or configuring the keyboard, or accessing the shell. These are the sorts of things that we can do from the DCUI. Okay, so now that we understand the basic concepts of the DCUI, if I want to change my root password, I can do so here. But let's go back to my management network. And you can see the first option is the network adapters. Here I am choosing the network adapter that's going to be used for the management network. So this particular ESXi host only has one VM NIC. It only has one physical adapter. But you may see 3 or 4 or 6 or however many physical adapters your host has. You'll see them listed here. You want to choose whichever physical adapter is connected to the VLAN or the network that all of your management traffic is going to flow over. So I've already got that selected. So I'm just going to hit escape here and go back. Here I can configure the VLAN. So if we need to do VLAN tagging and insert a VLAN number, so then as the traffic leaves this host on the management network, it's already tagged with a VLAN. I can do that here as well. I'm going to leave this blank, and that will mean that any of traffic leaving this host on this management VM kernel port will be untagged. And just to add a little more clarity to this VLAN option, if I am connected to a switch port that is tagged with a VLAN, the switch will handle that VLAN tagging for me. So really the only way that you would ever set this option is if you were hooked up to a trunk port on a switch and you actually needed to do the VLAN tagging within the host itself. So let's back out of that and let's go back to our IP version 4 configuration here. So currently we've gotten an IP address from DHCP, a dynamic IP, but I don't want to use that IP address. I want a static IP. So I'm going to modify this IP configuration to a different address. I'm going to modify my default gateway to a different value as well. And so the IP address that we're configuring here is the address of our management VM kernel port. This address is going to be used by vCenter to communicate with this host. If I need to connect to this host with PuTTY or some other SSH command line tool, this is going to be the address that I use. And then the default gateway is just simply, where's the router? If this host needs to communicate to something on some other network, where's the default gateway? Where is it going to send that traffic? So this all looks good. I'm going to go ahead and hit enter here to accept this configuration. And next I'm going to go to my DNS configuration and I am going to set up my own domain name server. here. So I'm going to set up a custom DNS server. I'm not going to use what was populated by DHCP. So I've got my DNS server address in here. I'm also going to put in my host name. I named this ESXi01. And I'll go ahead and hit enter. And there we go. Now I've configured the network settings that I want to configure here. So it's going to ask me, do I want to confirm these changes? I'm going to go ahead and click on Y for yes. And this is going to actually restart the management network of this ESXi host. And there we go. So now I can do some tests. Number one, I can restart the management network. If I've got some kind of network problem and I want to just restart the TCP/IP stack here, I can do that. I'm going to go to test management network and I'm going to do some pings. And you can see here there's some addresses that are pre-populated for me here. So what you're doing from this test management network screen is you're basically sending some pings to systems that we think, hey, we should be able to connect to these systems, like maybe my DNS server or my default gateway. So this is a good way for me to validate that, yeah, my management network that I've configured here is actually functioning properly. So let's go ahead and run these management network tests and see how they come back. And you can see here at the moment, it looks like they're going to fail. My pings are not going through, and I'm guessing my DNS resolution isn't going to work either, because at the moment I have this host connected to the wrong network. So this is the part of this process where you would actually go ahead and connect up your physical host to the network. But like I said, in my environment, I'm actually using VMware Workstation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to modify the settings of this virtual machine. I'm going to grab my network adapter and I'm going to just plug it into the correct network here. Okay, so now that we're connected to the appropriate network, let's test our management network one more time. I'm going to try to ping my domain controller here and my DNS server. I'm also going to try to resolve this host name. And in the background, I did go into my DNS server and just verify that that was set up in my forward and reverse lookup zones. So everything should work properly now. And there we go. I'm able to ping my DNS server and I'm able to resolve this host name as well. Okay, so now that I've validated my network connectivity, just a few final things I want to show you here. I can configure my keyboard layout. So I'm just going to stick with my US default, but if my keyboard is laid out differently for some different language, I can choose that option here. I can go to troubleshooting options and I can enable the ESXi shell. This will allow me to establish a command line session to this host. I can enable SSH so that I can remotely establish a command line session to this host. If you don't need these on, you should keep them disabled. From a best practice security perspective, leave the shell and leave SSH disabled unless you need it open. I can restart my management agents. So you don't want to do this unless something's going wrong. Like for example, let's say that vCenter is having a hard time communicating with this ESXi host, but you can ping vCenter from this host. You may need to restart the management agents to get it back up and running properly. I can view my system logs here as well. You can see the little list of logs that are available. I can view my support information. This might be stuff that I need to give to VMware support if they're helping me troubleshoot an issue here. I'm using an eval license and it shows my serial number and all that good stuff. So that's information that you may need to be able to provide VMware support. And then finally, reset system configuration is basically going to completely wipe out this ESXi host. It's going to destroy the entire configuration and bring it back to all of the defaults, right? So we'll still have ESXi 7 installed, but it'll be completely wiped out and brought back to the default configuration settings.